Hebrew scriptures the river is regularly referred to by the term or sometimes Yo. The word itself means stream or canal as at Daniel 12:5 and Isaiah 33:21, or water-filled gallery, a shaft made in mining, as at Job 28:10. In one case Ur is used to refer to the Tigris River, biblical Hydrochle of Mesopotamia. Dar 12:5-7. Compare 10:4. All other occurrences, the context indicates, apply to the Nile or, when in the plural form, to the Nile canals. PS 78:44. Issa 7:18. The Egyptian name Jow for the river, at least from the so-called 18th dynasty on, corresponds closely to the Hebrew. The course of the Nile. The Nile is generally ranked as the longest river on earth. Its length of 6,671 kilometers 4,145 mi is measured from its sources, which take their rise in the lake regions of modern Rwanda and Burundi. These sources flow into Lake Victoria, and from here a river passes over to Lake Albert, Lake Mobata, Sezi Seko. Farther north the stream is known as the White Nile. At Khartoum, the White Nile is joined by the Blue Nile, which cascades down from the mountains of northern Ethiopia. North of Khartoum the river forms the Nile proper, and as such receives the waters of only one more tributary, the Atbara River, its confluence with the Nile occurring about 300 kilometers 190 mi of Khartoum. The Nile then winds its way through the desolate Tabligh land of northern Sudan, passing over 6 separate beds of hard granite rock that create 6 cataracts between Khartoum and Aswan, biblical Sin, the point where Nubia ended, and ancient Egypt, typical scene along the Nile in Egypt. Nile 501 Gan. Finally, having lost much of its volume, because of evaporation by the blazing sun and the demands of Egyptian irrigation, some 2,700 kilometers 1,700 mi of Khartoum, the Nile's waters empty into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile Valley is quite narrow along most of the river's course. Through much of Nubia the river flows through a gorge, bordered on each side by the desert. North of Aswan, in what was Upper Egypt, the valley broadens out, but the rocky cliffs on either side are never much more than about 20 kilometers 12 mi apart. However, when the river reaches the region just end of modern Cairo, it divides into 2 main branches, now called the Rosetta and the Damietta, after the names of the port cities situated at the mouths of these branches on the Mediterranean coast. This fanning out of the Nile's waters creates the swampy Nile Delta. In ancient times the river had other branches, the classical Greek historians and geographers making mention of from 5 to 7. These branches and some of the canals have since become silted up and either greatly reduced or eliminated. Importance of annual flooding. The unique characteristic of this major river is the regularity of its rise each year and the consequent flooding of its banks that are lined with agricultural villages. This is produced by the heavy seasonal rains as well as the melting of snow from the mountains in Ethiopia, which convert the Blue Nile into a torrential stream rushing toward its junction with the White Nile, carrying with it rich silt from the Ethiopian highlands. The Atbara River also adds an increased flow to swell the volume of the Nile. Prior to the construction of the Aswan High Dam, this caused the river to begin to rise in Egypt from June onward, cresting in September and thereafter gradually receding. On receding, the waters left behind a deposit of highly fertile soil in the form of a thin layer of mud. In a virtually rainless land, Egyptian agriculture was totally dependent upon these annual inundations of the lowlands. An insufficient rise had the same effect as drought, bringing famine. While an excessive rise brought damage to the irrigation works as well as to homes. The concern of the Egyptians for a desirable amount of inundation is seen in the Nilometer gauges for measuring the river's level that have been discovered at ancient sites. Without these inundations the never-distant desert would press in from both sides right up to the riverbanks. Yet the Nile's rise and fall has, with few exceptions, been so regular that Egypt throughout its history was noted for its abundant crops and agricultural wealth. This complete reliance of the Egyptian economy on the Nile's waters was well illustrated in Pharaoh's dream, the 7 fat cows proceeding out of the Nile and feeding on the Nile grass, while the 7 thin cows came from the same source. This aptly represented the way good production could be eaten up by poor years resulting from insufficient inundation. G 41. 17-21. The surging of the Nile waters over their banks was used to describe the forward push of marching armies. G 46. 7, 8. 47. 2, 3, while the Prophet Amos used the rising and falling of the Nile River Medidara and Ense Delta Edsa Nilia for Memphis Thebes no Arman 1 St cataract S1 sin 2 Nd cataract 3 RD cataract 4 Th cataract 5 Th cataract 2 BRARIVER 6 Th cataract Khartoum BLUEN LEWH at NILE Lake Albert Lake Victoria FRIC in Iowa Nile canals 502 Nile's waters to represent the agitation due to come upon unfaithful Israel. 8. 9. 5 other prophets employed the figure of the Nile's drying up to represent the disaster due to come upon Egypt as a result of God's judgment against the nation. The Nile's failure would not only cripple agriculture and the raising of stock, but also damage the fishing industry and the production of linen. Issa 19. 1, 5-10. Es 29. 9, 10. Zik 10. 11. To retain some of the floodwaters for later use in irrigation during the growing season, the Egyptians built up earthen embankments to trap the muddy waters in large catch basins. Thus when Jehovah brought the first plague on Egypt, turning its water to blood, the Nile itself, the water in its canals and reedy pools, and the impounded waters were all converted into blood. X 7. 14-25. Other features. Besides supplying water for plants and domestic animals, the Nile was the source of drinking water for the Egyptians. X 7. 18, 21, 24 Except during the initial stage of inundation, the water was very palatable. Along the Nile's canals and reedy pools, papyrus plants grew in abundance. These were the source of Egyptian writing material and were used for making boats. Issa 18. 2 The reedy shores and pools were the habitat of many wild birds that fed upon frogs and other small creatures. X 8. 5, 9-11 Egyptian pictures show bird hunting being done from small boats. The Nile waters served, too, for bathing. It is recorded that Pharaoh's daughter bathed there. X 2. 5 An Egyptian picture presents a very similar bathing scene of a noble woman with her 4 female attendants. The Nile was also the principal highway for the entire land. Boats heading in traveled downstream on the current, while those heading us upstream were pushed along by the prevailing winds moving inland from the Mediterranean Sea on the north. Commercial ships from Phoenicia and Crete were able to go upstream all the way to Thebes biblical No Arman. Na 3. 8 and beyond. The Nile figured prominently in Egyptian defenses against invasion. Its cataracts to the east made the land difficult to attack from the direction of Nubia Ethiopia, while the swampy land around the delta region hindered the entrance of large armies from the Asiatic continent. Some scholars suggest that Assyrian king Sennacherib's boast of drying up all the Nile canals with his feet signified his confidence in his being able to overcome defensive water-filled moats around Egyptian cities and strongholds. 2K 19. 24. The Nile's cycles served as the basis for the seasonal calendar of the Egyptians, with 3 famine seasons. Akhet, or inundation. Peret, the coming forth evidently of the land as the waters returned to their banks. And Shamu, the dry season summer. The period just after the waters were highest was that of the greatest activity. When high water levels prevailed, construction work was programmed to provide a measure of employment. The symbol of the great sea monster lying stretched out in the midst of the Nile canals, applied to Pharaoh in the book of Ezekiel, is thought to be drawn from the crocodiles that have inhabited the Nile from ancient times. Es 29. 3-5 Frequent, 2. Was the hippopotamus, generally identified with the animal designated as behemoth at Job 40. 15. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile as a god of fertility under the name Hapi. This god was depicted as basically male, but with large feminine breasts, the head crowned with aquatic plants, and a fisherman's girdle around the plump waist. Festivals, with accompanying sacrifices, were held annually in his honor at the beginning of each inundation period. Some scholars suggest that Pharaoh's going out to the Nile, mentioned at Exodus 7. 15, relates to some morning devotional act, though it may have been merely for a morning walk or to examine the height of the river. Nile canals. Irrigation canals branching Otex to Acute Muritra Longo, Nineveh 503 Kata location in the S of Moab. Thus many prefer identification with the Wadi Namera, which flows down into the send of the Dead Sea about 17 km 11 MWSW of Karak. The prophecies foretell that these waters will become mere desolations, either in a figurative sense, because of the desolating of the land, or perhaps because of damming up of their streams by enemy forces. Nimrod, son of Cush. 1ch1. 10 The rabbinic writings derived the name Nimrod from the Hebrew verb marmidal.rad, meaning rebel. Thus, the Babylonian Talmud Erubin 53a states, "Why, then, was he called Nimrod? Because he stirred up the whole world to rebel against his God's sovereignty." Encyclopedia of Biblical Interpretation, by Menahem M. Gasher, Volume 2, 1955, p. 79. Nimrod was the founder and king of the first empire to come into existence after the flood. He distinguished himself as a mighty hunter before in an unfavorable sense. Heb. Lipmiddle.net. Against or in opposition to. Compare New 16. 2. 1ch14. 8. 2ch14. 10 or in front of Jehovah. GE 10. 9. FTN. Although in this case some scholars attach a favorable sense to the Hebrew preposition meaning in front of, the Jewish Targums, the writings of the historian Josephus, and also the context of Genesis chapter 10 suggest that Nimrod was a mighty hunter in defiance of Jehovah. The beginning of Nimrod's kingdom included the cities of Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Karnak, all in the land of Shinar. GE 10. 10. Therefore it was likely under his direction that the building of Babel and its tower began. This conclusion is also in agreement with the traditional Jewish view. Wrote Josephus. Nimrod little by little transformed the state of affairs into a tyranny, holding that the only way to detach men from the fear of God was by making them continuously dependent upon his own power. He threatened to have his revenge on God if he wished to inundate the earth again. For he would build a tower higher than the water could reach and avenge the destruction of their forefathers. The people were eager to follow this advice of Nimrod, deeming it slavery to submit to God. So they set out to build the tower. And it rose with a speed beyond all expectation. Jewish Antiquities, I, 114, 115 4, 2, 3. It appears that after the building of the Tower of Babel, Nimrod extended his domain to the territory of Assyria and there built Nineveh and Hoboth-ir and Calah and Resen between Nineveh and Calah. This is the great city. GE 10. 11, 12. Compare Mic 5. 6. Since Assyria evidently derived its name from Shem's son Ashur, Nimrod, as a grandson of Ham, must have invaded Shemite territory. So it would seem that Nimrod made the start in becoming a mighty one or hero, not only as a hunter of animals, but also as a warrior, a man of aggression. GE 10. 8 observes the Cyclopedia by M. Clintock and Strong. That the mighty hunting was not confined to the chase is apparent from its close connection with the building of 8 cities. What Nimrod did in the chase as a hunter was the earlier token of what he achieved as a conqueror. For hunting and heroism were of old especially and naturally associated. The Assyrian monuments also picture many feats in hunting, and the word is often employed to denote campaigning. The chase and the battle, which in the same country were connected so closely in after times, may therefore be virtually associated or identified here. The meaning then will be, that Nimrod was the first after the flood to found a kingdom, to unite the fragments of scattered patriarchal rule, and consolidate them under himself as sole-headed master. And all this in defiance of Jehovah, for it was the violent intrusion of Hamitic power into a Shemitic territory. 1894, Volume 7, p. 109. Concerning deification of Nimrod, see gods and goddesses of Babylonian deities. Nimshi. Father of Jehoshaphat Textoi Acute Muritra Longo, Nineveh 504 Qunjik. However, excavations have brought to light much that testifies to Nineveh's past glory. The findings include thousands of cuneiform tablets from Ashurbanipal's library and the ruins of the palace of Sennacherib and that of Ashurbanipal. These palaces were impressive structures. Based on his findings, Sir Austin Layard wrote, "The interior of the Assyrian palace must have been as magnificent as imposing. I have led the reader through its ruins, and he may judge of the impression its halls were calculated to make upon the stranger who in the days of old entered for the first time the abode of the Assyrian kings. He was ushered in through the portal guarded by the colossal lions or bulls of white alabaster. In the first hall he found himself surrounded by the sculptured records of the empire. Battles, sieges, triumphs, the exploits of the chase, the ceremonies of religion, were portrayed on the walls, sculptured in alabaster, and painted in gorgeous colors. Under each picture were engraved, in characters filled up with bright copper, inscriptions describing the scenes represented. Above the sculptures were painted other events. The king, attended by his eunuchs and warriors, receiving his prisoners, entering into alliances with other monarchs, or performing some sacred duty. These representations were enclosed in colored borders, of elaborate and elegant design. The emblematic tree, winged bulls, and monstrous animals, were conspicuous amongst the ornaments. At the upper end of the hall was the colossal figure of the king in adoration before the supreme deity, receiving from his eunuch the holy cup. He was attended by warriors bearing his arms, and by the priests or presiding divinities. His robes, and those of his followers, were adorned with groups of figures, animals, and flowers, all painted with brilliant colors. The stranger trod upon alabaster slabs, each bearing an inscription, recording the titles, genealogy, and achievements of the great king. Several doorways, formed by gigantic winged lions or bulls, or by the figures of guardian deities, lead into other apartments, which again opened into more distant halls. In each were new sculptures. On the walls of some were processions of colossal figures. Armed men and eunuchs following the king, warriors laden with spoil, leading prisoners, or bearing presents and offerings to the gods. On the walls of others were portrayed the winged priests, or presiding divinities, standing before the sacred trees. The ceilings above him were divided into square compartments, painted with flowers, or with the figures of animals. Some were inlaid with ivory, each compartment being surrounded by elegant borders and mouldings. The beams, as well as the sides of the chambers, may have been gilded, or even plated, with gold and silver. And the rarest woods, in which the cedar was conspicuous, were used for the woodwork. Square openings in the ceilings of the chambers admitted the light of day. Nineveh and its Remains, 1856, Part 2, pages 207-209. In the time of Jonah. Jehovah's prophet Jonah, in the 9th century BCE declared impending doom for Nineveh because of the wickedness of its inhabitants. However, since the people, including the king, repented, Jehovah spared the city. John 1. 1, 2, 3, 2, 5-10. At that time Nineveh was a great city, with a walking distance of 3 days. John 3. 3. Its population numbered more than 120,000 men. John 4. 11. This biblical description is not controverted by archaeological evidence. Observed André Parrot, Curator-in-Chief of the French National Museums. Just as today, that part of London which lies within its ancient boundary is very different from what is called Greater London, a term which includes the suburbs and denotes a much larger area. So it may be that people who lived far away from Assyria understood by the word Nineveh what is now known as the Assyrian O Textoia Cutmuritra Longo, Nisan 505, when the combined forces of Nabopolassar the king of Babylon and of Cyaxares the Mede besieged and captured Nineveh. The city was evidently subjected to burning, for many Assyrian reliefs show damage or stain from fire and accompanying smoke. The Babylonian Chronicle on Nineveh's destruction reports: they carried off the vast booty of the city and the temple, and turned the city into a ruin heap. Assyrian and Babylonian Chronicles, by A. Grayson, 1975, p. 94. Picture, Volume 1, p. 958. To this day Nineveh is a desolate waste, and in the spring, flocks graze near or atop the Mount of Kunjek. Date of Nineveh's fall. Though effaced from the extant cuneiform tablet that relates the fall of Nineveh, the date for this event, the 14th year of Nabopolassar, can be supplied from the context. It is also possible to place the destruction of Nineveh in the framework of Bible chronology. According to a Babylonian chronicle, the Egyptians were defeated at Karchemish in the 21st year of Nabopolassar's reign. The Bible shows this to have taken place in the 4th year of Jehoiakim's reign, or in 625 BCE, just 46. 2 Therefore, the capture of Nineveh about 7 years earlier in the 14th year of Nabopolassar's reign would fall in the year 632 BCE. See Assyria, the fall of the empire. Nisan and Nisan. The post-exilic name of the first Jewish lunar month of the sacred calendar, corresponding to part of March and part of April. Ne2. 1. S3. 7. This month, first called Abib, was originally considered the 7th month and is evidently the month referred to at Genesis 8. 4. At the time of the Exodus from Egypt, Jehovah assigned this month to be the first of the months of the year. X12. 2. 13. 4. New 33. 3. From then on, a distinction existed between a sacred calendar instituted by Jehovah and the previous secular calendar. See calendar. Abib. The weather was often quite cool during this spring month, and in Jerusalem, fires were lit at night to provide warmth. Joe 18. 18. Snow has even fallen in Jerusalem as late as April the 6th, as it did in 1949. Nisan came at about the close of the rainy season, and the latter or spring rains were counted on to bring the grain to fullness prior to the harvest. 11. 14. Ho 6. 3. J 5. 24. At this time of the year the Jordan River was normally at flood stage. Jos 3. 15. 1 Ch 12. 15. The barley harvest began along the coastal plains, and down in the subtropical Jordan Valley the wheat was reaching maturity. Ru 1. 22. 2. 23. About this time, harvested flax on Rahab's rooftop in Jericho provided a place for the Israelite spies to hide. Jos 2. 6. 4. 19. Adjusting the lunar calendar. God's command required that the Israelites offer up a sheaf of the first fruits of their harvest on the 16th day of Nisan Abib, and that, on the 50th day thereafter, they offer up a second grain offering. These offerings corresponded naturally with the barley and wheat harvests, respectively. This precept made essential an adjustment in the calendar of lunar months used by the Israelites. There was need to compensate for the difference of 111/4 days between the full solar year and the shorter lunar year. Otherwise, within the space of 3 years, the month of Nisan would arrive some 33 days earlier in the season and far ahead of the barley harvest. The Bible record does not specify what method was originally used by the Israelites to accomplish such coordination, but the evidence indicates that a 13th month was added every 2 or 3 years to restore the seasons to their proper position in the calendar year. It seems likely that it was determined by simple observation, relating the new moon to the vernal, or spring, equinox of the sun, which comes about March the 21st of each year. If the new moon that would ordinarily mark the start of the month of Nisan Abib was too distant from the time of the spring equinox, then the month was counted as a 13th, or in Turkulario textoi acute miritra longo. Nishrok 506. Nisan continues to be observed by his followers till this day as the time for memorializing Christ's death. Lu 22. 19, 20. See Lord's evening meal. Nisrok. A deity worshipped by Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. It was in the temple of Nisroch that Adrammelech and Sharezer murdered their father Sennacherib. 2K 19. 36, 37. Issa 37. 38. A number of scholars suggest identifying Nisroch with the fire god Nusku, who, it was thought, assisted in bringing defeat to the enemy in warfare and served as messenger of the gods as well as a dispenser of justice. However, certain identification of Nisroch with a known Assyrian deity is not now possible.